Imagine standing at the threshold of your own backyard, only to be told by a guest who arrived 7 decades ago that you aren't allowed to step on the grass. A few days ago, one of South Korea's top national security officials arrived at the gates of the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ. He wasn't there for a military exercise. He was there for a high-level, sensitive inspection of his own country's territory. But as he approached the line, he was met with an unexpected and firm no. It wasn't the North Koreans who stopped him. It was the United Nations Command, the UNC. Back in Seoul, the reaction was immediate and visceral. One government minister, visibly frustrated, publicly questioned where the dignity of a sovereign nation had gone if it couldn't even authorize its own people to walk through its own land. To the ruling party, this wasn't just a procedural hiccup, it was an insult. They moved with lightning speed, drafting new legislation designed to finally strip the UN command of this power and return sovereignty to the Korean people. It felt like a long overdue correction of history. But then something unprecedented happened. The UN command, which usually operates in the quiet shadows of military bureaucracy and intermilitary channels, suddenly stepped into the light. They issued a formal public statement, the first of its kind in history on this specific topic, effectively telling the South Korean government that their new laws didn't matter. They didn't use emotional language or talk about dignity. They simply pointed to a piece of paper signed in 1953. They argued that according to international law, the DMZ isn't just land, it's a legal jurisdiction that exists outside the reach of local politicians. This sudden public clash has exposed a deep and uncomfortable rift. On one side is a modern global power trying to reclaim its space. On the other is a 72-year-old international treaty that refuses to bend. It forces us to ask a question that most thought was settled decades ago. In the strip of land that separates war from peace, who actually holds the keys?
And that is the absolute core of our deep dive today. We are witnessing a public clash that is so much more significant than a simple bureaucratic disagreement over an access permit. This is fundamentally about tension, the powerful, immediate demands for national sovereignty coming out of Seoul versus the binding, stabilizing nature of international legal jurisdiction that has successfully maintained regional security for over 7 decades.
Right.
Our mission is to unpack this specific incident and connect it to broader global phenomena. We're going to examine how this challenge to the armistice relates to the wider trends of democratic institutional decay and the acute political polarization that we see playing out globally. Ultimately, this deep dive is a case study on the difficult reality of maintaining peace. How complex it is for modern democracies to live inside the legal and institutional structures that guarantee their very survival.
Okay, let's unpack that initial incident, because the context of who was stopped and why is just so crucial. This wasn't a minor official. We're talking about a high-level South Korean national security official.
Right.
Trying to do a sensitive inspection, that just underscores the seriousness of it. And yet, the UN command, the UNC, stopped them cold.
That's right. The level of friction was astonishing, precisely because of the rank of the official involved. It signals that this was a deliberate test of the UNC's authority by the South Korean government.
And the UNC met that test.
They met it with an equally deliberate refusal. And the reaction in Seoul, it wasn't just frustration. The word used was visceral, a deep emotional outburst focused on the symbolic insult.
Yeah.
When a government minister publicly questions the dignity of a sovereign nation because it can't authorize entry into its own territory, you've moved way beyond a procedural argument. You're into a matter of national pride and identity. The political stakes just went through the roof.
And the political system responded with that same intensity. The ruling party moved immediately to draft legislation to strip the UNC of its DMZ entry control power. The specific goal was to transfer approval authority for, civilian and non-military access directly to the South Korean unification minister. And they weren't just proposing a bill, they were framing this as a long overdue correction of history.
And that framing is so important. By calling it a correction of history, they activate this incredibly potent political narrative.
Right.
That the post-war status quo is some outdated infringement that has to be fixed by a modern sovereign democracy. They're arguing that control over the DMZ should belong to a South Korean cabinet member, reflecting complete independence.
But then came the UNC's public response, and this is where it shifted from sort of political posturing to a cold, hard legal fight.
Yeah.
The UNC issued that formal public statement, which you said was unprecedented on this. Why was going public such a big escalation?
It signaled that the standard quiet diplomacy had totally collapsed. The UNC, which has personnel from 18 nations, usually manages these access issues through the Military Armistice Commission, or MAC. That's the military oversight body from the 53 agreement. And these discussions are normally handled in, low-profile meetings between U.S. Forces Korea, who represent the UNC, and the South Korean military.
So it's all back-channel stuff, normally.
Exactly. The fact that the UNC felt they had to issue a formal press release confirms that those intermilitary talks were in deep trouble. The political pressure in Seoul was likely just overriding the pragmatic security concerns the military professionals shared.
So going public was a signal.
It served two purposes. First, to assert their jurisdiction very clearly to the South Korean public. And second, to signal to the international community, especially those other UNC member states, that the core peace mechanism was under threat from one of its own signatories.
And what's so striking is that they didn't engage on those political terms like dignity or sovereignty. They fought purely on legal grounds.
That's the key.
They argued that DMZ management is a matter of jurisdiction, not sovereignty, and it's all based on the 1953 Armistice Agreement.
Exactly. They weren't denying that the DMZ is South Korean land. What they were asserting is that, for the purpose of maintaining the ceasefire, the treaty mandates UNC control. The DMZ is unique. It's not a national park. It's the physical manifestation of an incomplete war. Its whole status is defined by the fact that the fighting just stopped, so that makes it a legal jurisdiction. And they back this up with specific legal language.
Okay, so what were the specific articles that formed the bedrock of their argument?
Well, the UNC explicitly cited two sections of the Armistice Agreement. First, Article 1, Section 10.
Okay.
This article states very clearly that, quote, civil administration and relief south of the MDL belong to the commander-in-chief of the UN command.
So that gives the UNC commander the explicit authority to manage civilian activities like the inspection that was blocked.
It's a very specific grant of power, and it's necessary for the functional separation of the forces.
And the second one?
The second was Article 1, Section 9, which says any military or civilian entry into the DMZ requires special MAC or UNC approval. This basically establishes their role as the gatekeeper. The UNC is the successor to the MAC in this function.
Let's talk about the MAC for a second. Who's on the MAC now, and why is that approval so critical?
Well, the MAC, or what's left of it, has historically involved representatives from the UNC in North Korea. Now, the North Koreans pretty much withdrew from active participation back in the early 90s.
Right.
But the UNC maintains the structure and the legal authority. So its continued existence means any entry into the DMZ, by definition, has to be vetted through the very mechanism designed to prevent an accidental conflict.
So is South Korea's unification minister just unilaterally granted access?
It would be a de facto assertion that the MAC structure, and therefore the armistice's control mechanism, no longer applies to South Korea's half of the DMZ. It pulls a thread that could unravel the whole thing.
So the UNC is basically saying their control isn't a political choice. It's a binding legal duty from that 1953 document, all to make sure the ceasefire doesn't just collapse.
Precisely. To go back to your opening analogy, Seoul is saying, this is our house, we decide who walks in. And the UNC is clarifying, we agree it's your house, but you signed a lease in 1953 that granted us specific authority over the front gate as long as the war is just paused. Quote, our control is about the terms of the lease that maintain peace, not your ultimate ownership. This clash has just exposed a profound legal fault line that a lot of people thought was settled a long, long time ago.
This whole incident really brings up a much broader problem for established democracies, doesn't it? This temptation for domestic political movements to try and legislate their way out of, inconvenient international obligations.
It really does.
I was struck by the notes about a legal researcher in Seoul who was actually involved in drafting this kind of legislation. He described this moment of, a chilling realization.
Yeah, that detail is so powerful because it personalizes the risk of what some analysts call the erosion of treaty integrity. The researcher realized that by pushing for a domestic law to supersede the armistice, he wasn't just scoring a political point. He was quietly unraveling the stitches of this huge, fragile safety net that had held the Korean peace for 70 years.
So this dispute is a case study.
It's a clinical case study of how institutional decay often begins. It starts when domestic legislative overreach tries to undermine these existing functionalist legal frameworks like the 1953 armistice. For the international community, and especially those 18 UNC member nations, that treaty is the single indispensable safety net holding back a new war. It can't be treated like a suggestion you can just vote away in your own parliament.
But practically speaking, if the South Korean National Assembly, as the sovereign legislative body, passes a law saying the unification minister controls access, why can't the UNC just be told to comply? Doesn't the will of the people carry weight?
It carries immense domestic weight, absolutely. But in international law, it runs headlong into the immovable force of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, the VCLT.
Right.
The VCLT is the globally accepted rulebook for how treaties work, and South Korea is a party to this convention. The UNC's whole legal argument leans very heavily on this framework.
So tell us specifically about the VCLT provision that acts as the ultimate shield here.
We're talking about VCLT Article 27. And this article dictates that a state cannot invoke its own domestic law as a reason for failing to perform its treaty obligations.
That seems pretty black and white.
It's a foundational principle for global stability. I mean, imagine the chaos if any nation could just nullify a trade deal or a security pact by passing a local ordinance. So if South Korea unilaterally passes a law to bypass the Armistice, which is an international treaty, that action would be a direct material violation of Article 27.
So the treaty is valid until it's replaced by a peace treaty or an end-of-war declaration.
Exactly. Until that happens, domestic law alone just cannot bypass the binding nature of the treaty. It doesn't matter how popular or emotionally resonant that domestic law might be.
So the law they're trying to pass is effectively performative legislation. It's meant to boost national pride, address that public sense of insult. But in the eyes of the international legal framework that keeps the peace, it's functionally null and void.
And worse, it's a diplomatic liability.
Right.
It is precisely that. A political win that's a legal non-starter and a major diplomatic risk. And this leads right to that core criticism you hear in Seoul, that the UNC is some foreign entity infringing on South Korean sovereignty.
And this is where the rhetoric really heats up. We see critics arguing that the UNC's control echoes that old North Korean "our nation among ourselves" rhetoric.
Yes, the idea that the two Koreas should just resolve everything without any outsiders. Yep. And that comparison is drawn by some legal observers because it highlights the danger of adopting that kind of isolationist, nationalist framework. It seeks to sideline the very security partners whose commitment to the armistice is the foundation of South Korea's security.
But the UNC was careful to counter that, right? They pointed out how big a role South Korea already plays.
They were very careful. In that public statement, the UNC emphasized that core tasks like day-to-day security along the MDL, infrastructure support, medical evacuations, all of that is already managed directly by the South Korean military.
That's a vital distinction. The UNC isn't running the whole show.
Not at all. It's a very specialized functional role. The UNC is focused strictly on entry control and peace maintenance as required by the treaty. They emphasize the nation's leading role in sovereignty and self-defense.
It's a division of labor.
It is. It's an organic, functionalist security mechanism. The UNC's jurisdiction is narrow, mandated by the treaty, and necessary to avoid a breakdown.
And the fact they had to go public so loudly implies that the quiet negotiations, the U.S.-South Korean military talks, must have completely hit a wall.
That public statement is the sound of a legal tripwire being hit. When the political pressure in Seoul became so intense that a law was being drafted to circumvent the armistice.
Bypassing all the established channels?
Yes. The UNC had no choice but to use its strongest tool, a formal public legal assertion. It confirms that the internal pragmatic cooperation between militaries had been totally overridden by political elements who were prioritizing a symbolic victory. They were forced to say, publicly, this isn't a hiccup. It's an existential threat to the 1953 agreement.
This clash over jurisdiction feels symptomatic of something much bigger, though. It's not just about an old treaty. It's about these modern political forces finding reasons to challenge established functional institutions, even security institutions, for ideological gain.
Yeah, that's the crucial transition point. This political push to reclaim jurisdiction is characterized by some analysts as radical deconstructionism.
Radical deconstructionism.
It's a movement that leverages intensely emotional appeals to national sovereignty. You know, the rally cry of, "A house where the owner cannot enter is not a home," to justify dissolving structures that, while maybe imperfect, have effectively maintained stability.
There was that story about a local official, a Mr. Park, who campaigned fiercely against the UNC's authority using that exact kind of rhetoric. But his view totally changed when he got a private tour of the joint security area.
Yes. He was all about the rhetoric of national dignity. But during his tour, he saw the blue UN flag flying next to the South Korean flag at a key checkpoint. And he had the sudden realization
that the very interference he was fighting against,
and the organic security mechanism that guaranteed the guns on the other side, stayed silent. He was campaigning to dismantle the very structure that let his constituents sleep in peace at night. That's radical deconstructionism. It prioritizes nationalist self-assertion over the geopolitical reality required for peace.
It seems like a classic case of politics just ignoring functional reality. And this whole incident signals a breakdown of the historical bipartisan security consensus that governed South Korean politics for decades.
Absolutely. Historically, both major political wings, conservative and liberal, they operated under a shared, unspoken understanding.
And what was that?
That the ROK-US alliance and the functional role of the UNC were the common sense floor of security. They were necessary, non-negotiable foundations. But that consensus is rapidly fracturing. We're seeing a broader trend where elite institutions betray these established common sense standards. Now, powerful political voices are treating old security agreements as suppressive relics of the past, instead of seeing them as the functional guarantors of the present.
And when leaders shift from asking what keeps us safe to who are we independent of outside help,
that shift carries profound and measurable risks to stability.
And we don't have to just rely on qualitative analysis here. We actually have quantitative data on the deep ideological polarization inside the South Korean National Assembly itself. Researchers used advanced natural language processing models, BERT and GPT-2, these sophisticated AI language models, and applied them to legislative minutes to measure the political distance.
This NLP analysis is revolutionary because it gives you an objective, data-driven measurement of ideological distance. It's free from polling bias or subjective interpretation.
So how do these models actually quantify polarization? It sounds pretty technical.
It is, but the principle is clear. BERT and GPT-2 are trained to understand context and nuance in human language. When you apply them to legislative minutes, the models analyze the specific vocabulary, the framing, the linguistic patterns used by different political parties.
So, like, do they use different words for the same thing?
Exactly. Do they use different keywords for economic policy? Do they frame the opposition as enemies or colleagues? By measuring the divergence of this language, the models can quantify the ideological distance between the parties over time. A greater linguistic distance means higher polarization.
So what did they find when they ran this analysis on the historical records?
The analysis showed that polarization has historically been cyclical in South Korea. It would spike, then decline, which is normal.
Right.
They found sharp temporary spikes in the early 2010s, but the models revealed a critical structural shift. Polarization increased sharply in late 2016 and has remained at a high sustained level ever since.
The fact that the spike has endured is the crucial insight, isn't it?
Precisely. The pre-2016 spikes were just temporary heat. The post-2016 sustained high level is interpreted as a deeper, more enduring set of ideological differences. It's a structural, not a cyclical, polarization. The data confirms the chasm is getting wider and more permanent.
And what are the political consequences of operating in this kind of environment, especially for something as critical as national security or the DMZ?
The consequences are severe. This polarized environment pushes parties to seek immediate ideological gains over pragmatic, effective governance.
So they're playing to the base.
They're playing to their base. They favor policies and symbolic gestures like challenging the UNC that appeal to their most dedicated supporters, rather than seeking the cross-party compromise you need for long-term stability. And what's more, political opponents are increasingly cast as enemies, not just colleagues with different views. Compromise becomes betrayal. So maintaining a bipartisan consensus on sensitive issues like security or treaties becomes almost impossible. The DMZ clash is just one symptom of a deep-seated institutional inability to find common ground.
This tension between the high ideals of law, like the VCLT, and the messy reality of polarized politics brings us to the core issue of institutional health in South Korea. If polarization prevents compromise, then the formal systems of checks and balances become even more vital. Before we dive in, let's just clarify a term. What exactly is horizontal accountability, or HA?
Horizontal accountability is the system of checks and balances among state institutions designed to hold the executive accountable. It's defined by legally empowered state agencies taking action, from routine oversight to investigations or even impeachment, against another state agency that's seen to be acting unlawfully.
So it's the lifeblood of a healthy democracy.
Absolutely. It prevents corruption and curbs improper state power by ensuring institutional restraint.
And based purely on its constitutional design, South Korea looks like it should be a model for this.
In terms of de jure optimality, so, on paper, South Korea's constitutional configuration is world-class. Data from the Comparative Constitutions Project shows SK's charter provides a near-optimal balance. It has one of the most workable checks and balances mechanisms among third-wave democracies. It avoids the usual pitfalls, like an imperial president or a totally subservient legislature.
And the judicial appointment system is a prime example of this design, isn't it? Can you walk us through how that co-appointment mechanism works?
It's a very deliberate and sophisticated structure. For the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice is appointed by the President, but needs the National Assembly's consent. The other justices are also appointed by the President on the Chief Justice's recommendation, but again, they need Assembly consent.
And the Constitutional Court is even more complex.
Even more so. Its 9 justices are split, 3 appointed by the President, 3 by the National Assembly, and 3 by the Chief Justice. And crucially, all 9 appointments require the National Assembly's consent. This co-appointment system ensures no single branch can just pack the high courts. It's designed to promote institutional independence.
So the design is excellent, it mandates balance, but the de facto reality, the actual performance, seems much more volatile than the design suggests.
Precisely. The reality is one of de facto oscillation and careening. South Korea's actual HA performance has not lived up to its stellar design. Instead, its performance is oscillated, swinging violently between periods of erosion from about 2005 to 2014 and then recovery from 2015 to 2019. This instability is explained by a concept known as democratic careening.
Careening? It sounds like a car lurching from one side of the road to the other. How does that work in politics?
It's a great metaphor. The instability is driven by executive overreach that swings based on the ideology of the president in power. It careens in one of 2 ways. The first is populist excess, typically driven by liberal presidents. They operate with a strong popular mandate and believe their election win gives them the authority to push through reforms quickly, often prioritizing that mandate over constitutional constraints.
So the will of the people justifies sidestepping the rules.
Right. The second is oligarchical excess, often driven by conservative presidents. They prioritize defending constitutional constraints and elite structures, sometimes to the detriment of the popular mandate. They might use powerful institutions, like the prosecution service, to target political opponents, justifying it as maintaining constitutional order. This constant lurching destabilizes the whole system.
And this careening is often made worse by one specific institution that seems to have disproportionate power, the prosecution service.
The prosecution service holds what analysts call infungible power.
Meaning its power can't be substituted.
Exactly. It's the highest law enforcement agency, and critically, only the prosecutor's office has the legal authority to indict elected politicians. They have immense operational autonomy.
That power to indict politicians is the ultimate legal check. But if it's exploited for political ends, it becomes a massive destabilizing force.
And historically, it has been. Because of its autonomy, the service has repeatedly been at the center of political controversy. Despite attempts to make it neutral, it's proven really difficult to hold the service accountable. Prosecutors often exploit their autonomy to maximize their own power and reputation, which leads to constant questions about whether their high-profile actions are politically motivated or genuinely just about law enforcement. This just fuels the careening.
The challenges South Korea faces with HA, this tension between strong rules on paper and a volatile reality, are clearly not unique. They reflect a global trend where institutional decay often starts with the erosion of horizontal accountability. So let's broaden our view and compare South Korea's situation with other third-wave democracies.
This comparative analysis is vital. It shows that SK is struggling with universal challenges of democratic consolidation. We can see how different structures and political cultures have developed mechanisms that either undermined or sometimes unintentionally strengthen their HA.
Okay, let's start with Indonesia. On paper, they have strong checks and balances, but their HA often fails. What's their main challenge?
Indonesia's primary structural challenge is what we call the accountability trap. While they have robust de jure HA mechanisms, the system is basically hampered by the executive's practice of forming a near-unanimous fat coalition in the legislature.
A fat coalition, so it's too big to be challenged.
Exactly. It's based on cartel politics. The president brings almost all major parties into the ruling coalition, often by offering up ministerial posts. This eliminates any strong institutional opposition.
So the legislature has no incentive to check the executive?
None at all. They're part of the same team. The powerful opposition you need to trigger HA mechanisms just doesn't exist. So the executive goes unchecked.
Fascinating. A system where the political culture just bypasses the constitutional structure. Now, let's shift to Mongolia. How does their experience compare?
Mongolia is a case of structural imbalance achieved through deliberate constitutional changes. Over the years, they've shifted power heavily toward an all-powerful parliament and prime minister. Legislative power became decisively dominant.
And what happened to the counterbalancing forces?
They were systematically weakened. The judiciary is structurally weak because key appointments are political, made by the now dominant parliament. And the executive's role, the presidency, has been severely minimized. When power concentrates so overwhelmingly in one branch, de facto accountability just plummets.
It sounds like a slow-motion institutional failure. Moving over to Pakistan, their challenges seem rooted less in structure and more in just chronic inter-institutional interference.
Pakistan is defined by a constant, exhausting tussle between the pillars of democracy, often fueled by the military's influence. The problem is institutions constantly overreaching into each other's lanes. You see the judiciary, especially, overreaching into executive and legislative domains, creating chaos.
And their accountability bodies are compromised too.
Deeply. The National Accountability Bureau, their main anti-corruption body, is widely seen as a tool for selective accountability used by governments to target rivals. And other bodies, like the Public Accounts Committee, are weakened by massive backlogs and ruling party members shielding the government. It's a general failure of enforcement.
Finally, let's look at Taiwan, which presents this really interesting paradox where an informal political practice actually boosted accountability.
Taiwan's constitutional structure scored low on formal legislative power. But historically, the opposition developed powerful informal tools. They relied heavily on the filibuster and closed-door party caucus negotiations.
So they created a de facto veto.
They did. This informal use of procedural delays essentially gave the opposition a veto on sensitive legislation.
So inefficiency actually equaled more robust accountability.
Precisely. It forced the ruling party to seek real consensus, which strengthened HA, but at the cost of governability. Recently, though, rule changes have weakened this informal check, allowing the ruling party to advance its agenda more easily.
And what's the consequence of weakening that informal veto?
It shifts the balance toward governability and away from accountability. And when that happens, the burden of ensuring HA falls heavily on the independent courts and civil society as the last lines of defense. It shows that accountability is defined not just by the Constitution, but by the informal political culture that either respects or subverts it.
What stands out across all these examples, and especially in South Korea, is the deep irony. South Korea is fighting two simultaneous battles. There is the very public, emotional fight over a few feet of land in the DMZ, which is really a stand-in for the greater struggle between national pride and international treaty obligation. And then there's the internal political battle where deep ideological polarization is eroding the very bipartisan consensus and institutional health you need to make security policy work.
And this brings us back to the fundamental dilemma for a modern, established democratic state like South Korea. The challenge is maintaining unflinching adherence to the long-standing international legal structures that guarantee peace, specifically the 1953 Armistice Agreement, even when those structures feel restrictive or inconvenient or, offend national dignity. Political leaders, who are driven by the intense pressures of polarization, must resist the urge to leverage the very effective tool of domestic legislation for symbolic or identity-driven victories that could destabilize the core functionalist legal frameworks of the Korean Peninsula. At the end of the day, the risk of potentially collapsing the armistice structure far outweighs any perceived boost to temporary national pride. The law signed in 1953, supported by the VCLT, is the cold, hard legal reality of peace. And that reality has to be respected above transient political currents to safeguard the future.
That's a powerful framework for understanding the deep tensions at play. The confrontation over a simple permit reveals how deeply the structural and political health of a nation are intertwined with its most solemn international commitments. It makes you realize that the most potent threat to stability might not come from the outside, but from the deliberate erosion of institutional consensus within. The key question for South Korea, and really for any major democracy facing this kind of internal polarization, is how to reconcile the powerful emotional demands of nationalism with the cold, stabilizing requirements of international legal fidelity. It's a tightrope walk that requires immense political maturity.